The Dravaxi Empire stretched across 3 entire galaxies, and at its heart sat Empress Vera on a throne made of crystalline stone that hummed with ancient power. She ruled millions of worlds with absolute authority, her word becoming law the moment it left her lips. But for all her power, for all the armies and fleets that answered her command, she couldn't fix the one thing that truly mattered to her. Her children were broken. Prince Talon and Princess Lyria were 12 years old by Dravaxi standards, which made them roughly equivalent to human teenagers. They should have been preparing to take their place in the imperial court, learning diplomacy and statecraft, charming foreign dignitaries and demonstrating the strength that would one day hold this massive empire together. Instead, they drifted through the palace like ghosts, their faces blank, their voices silent. It had been 7 years since anyone heard them speak. 7 long years since the night their father died. The assassination happened during a state dinner. Security had been breached by a rival faction, and the emperor had thrown himself between the attackers and his children. He'd saved their lives but lost his own, bleeding out on the marble floor while Talon and Lyria watched from where he'd shoved them behind a pillar. They were 5 years old. And from that night forward, they never spoke another word. At first, everyone assumed it was temporary shock. Grief did strange things to young minds, after all. The imperial physicians assured Empress Vera that with time and care, the children would recover. But weeks became months, months became years, and the silence only deepened. The physicians tried everything their advanced science could offer. Neural stimulators to jumpstart speech centers in the brain. Psionic therapy to gently probe their traumatized minds. Memory extraction techniques that were technically illegal but nobody dared question when royalty was involved. Nothing worked. The twins remained locked inside themselves, communicating with no one, not even each other. The Empire began to whisper. In council chambers and on distant worlds, the question arose, could silent heirs really rule? The Dravaxi valued strength, decisiveness, the ability to command respect through presence and word. How could mute children ever hold together an empire built on the force of personality and the weight of tradition? Political rivals sensed blood in the water. Distant cousins of the imperial line, ambitious governors, even high-ranking military officers began positioning themselves as potential successors. They never said it openly, of course. That would be treason. But everyone understood the game being played. Empress Vera was still young by Dravaxi standards, but she wouldn't rule forever. And if her own children couldn't speak, couldn't lead, then eventually she'd have to name someone else as heir. The Empress tried to hide her desperation, but those close to her saw it clearly. She spent hours sitting with her children in silence, trying to coax even a single word from them. She brought in entertainers, teachers, even other children their age. Nothing penetrated the wall they'd built around themselves. Talon and Lyria existed in a world of two, their grief and trauma a fortress that kept everyone else out. Then came the proposal that changed everything. A junior minister, looking to make a name for himself, suggested something radical: hire humans for the palace staff. Humans had recently made contact with the Dravaxi Empire, offering labor contracts in exchange for technology and resources. They were considered primitive by Dravaxi standards, but they had something the more advanced species lacked: emotional intelligence. Empathy. An almost irrational ability to connect with others on a feeling level rather than a purely logical one. At first, everyone assumed it was temporary shock. Grief did strange things to young minds, after all. The imperial physicians assured Empress Vera that with time and care, the children would recover. But weeks became months, months became years, and the silence only deepened. The physicians tried everything their advanced science could offer. Neural stimulators to jumpstart speech centers in the brain. Psionic therapy to gently probe their traumatized minds. Memory extraction techniques that were technically illegal but nobody dared question when royalty was involved. Nothing worked. The twins remained locked inside themselves, communicating with no one, not even each other. The Empire began to whisper. In council chambers and on distant worlds, the question arose, could silent heirs really rule? The Dravaxi valued strength, decisiveness, the ability to command respect through presence and word. How could mute children ever hold together an empire built on the force of personality and the weight of tradition? Political rivals sensed blood in the water. Distant cousins of the imperial line, ambitious governors, even high-ranking military officers began positioning themselves as potential successors. They never said it openly, of course. That would be treason. But everyone understood the game being played. Empress Vera was still young by Dravaxi standards, but she wouldn't rule forever. And if her own children couldn't speak, couldn't lead, then eventually she'd have to name someone else as heir. The Empress tried to hide her desperation, but those close to her saw it clearly. She spent hours sitting with her children in silence, trying to coax even a single word from them. She brought in entertainers, teachers, even other children their age. Nothing penetrated the wall they'd built around themselves. Talon and Lyria existed in a world of two, their grief and trauma a fortress that kept everyone else out. Then came the proposal that changed everything. A junior minister, looking to make a name for himself, suggested something radical: hire humans for the palace staff. Humans had recently made contact with the Dravaxi Empire, offering labor contracts in exchange for technology and resources. They were considered primitive by Dravaxi standards, but they had something the more advanced species lacked: emotional intelligence, empathy, an almost irrational ability to connect with others on a feeling level rather than a purely logical one. The proposal was controversial. Many in the court saw it as beneath the dignity of the imperial palace to employ such backward creatures. But Empress Vera was out of options. If Dravaxi logic and science couldn't help her children, maybe human logic could. She approved the contract. Jake Miller was among the first wave of human workers to arrive on the Dravaxi homeworld. He was 52 years old with graying hair and the kind of weathered hands that came from a lifetime of manual labor. Back on Earth, he'd been a maintenance supervisor at a school district. When the opportunity came to work off-world for enough money to pay for his daughter's education, he'd signed up without hesitation. The contract was 5 years. 5 years of fixing alien air conditioners and mopping alien floors, and his daughter would graduate debt-free. He didn't expect adventure or glory. Jake was content to do his job, keep his head down, and count the days until he could go home. The Dravaxi barely acknowledged human workers anyway. To them, humans were little more than sophisticated cleaning equipment that happened to be made of flesh instead of metal. Jake was assigned to the east wing of the Imperial Palace, which housed the royal family's private quarters. It was considered a prestigious posting among the human workers, though Jake couldn't see why. He cleaned the same floors and fixed the same climate control units he would anywhere else. The only difference was the constant presence of armed guards and the occasionally glimpsed noble rushing past on important business. On his third night working the late shift, Jake was cleaning the corridor outside the royal children's suites when he heard it. The sharp crash of something breaking, followed by a sound that made his heart clench. Quiet, desperate breathing. The kind of breathing that came right before someone started crying but was fighting hard not to. He should have walked away. Protocol was clear: human workers were to avoid direct contact with royalty at all costs. If something was wrong, he was supposed to immediately notify the guards and let them handle it. But Jake had raised a daughter. He knew the sound of a kid in distress, alien or not. He pushed open the door to Princess Lyria's chambers and found her standing in the center of the room, surrounded by shattered crystalline sculptures. They'd been beautiful once, delicate things that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. Now they were just glittering fragments scattered across the floor. Lyria stared at them with eyes that seemed too old for her young face, her chest heaving with those barely controlled breaths. Jake didn't say anything at first. He just quietly grabbed a dustpan and brush from his cart and knelt down to start cleaning up the mess. And because it was late and he was tired and it was just habit, he started humming. An old lullaby his own mother used to sing to him when he was small. Nothing fancy, just a simple melody about moonlight and peace and being safe at home. He didn't notice Lyria watching him at first. He was focused on carefully gathering the sharp fragments, making sure he didn't miss any that someone might step on later. But when he finally looked up, he saw her. She'd sat down on the floor, her alien features calm for the first time, just watching this strange human janitor hum and clean like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jake smiled at her gently and went back to work. When he finished, he stood up slowly and wished her good night in the broken Dravaxi he'd been trying to learn. Then he noticed the boy standing in the doorway connecting the two royal suites. Prince Talon, watching with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. But there was something there. Something that hadn't been there before. Curiosity. The next night, both twins were waiting in the hallway when Jake arrived for his shift. They didn't speak or approach him. They just stood there, watching. Jake nodded to them politely and went about his work, humming different songs as he cleaned. And the twins followed him from room to room, always keeping their distance, but never leaving. For the first time in 7 years, something had captured their attention. The security footage caused an absolute firestorm in the Imperial Court. Someone in the monitoring department had noticed the unusual activity and flagged it for review. Within hours, every high-ranking official in the palace had seen the recordings, the human janitor wandering the corridors with two royal children trailing behind him like lost puppies. The twins who hadn't shown interest in anything for 7 years were now following a maintenance worker around while he mopped floors. The court split immediately into two camps. The first group, led by several traditionalist advisors, demanded Jake's immediate arrest and execution. How dare this primitive human presume to interact with royalty? Clearly he was manipulating the children somehow, probably using some kind of human mind control technique. They didn't care that humans didn't have mind control. They were terrified and angry, and they needed someone to blame. The second group, smaller but equally passionate, saw something different in those recordings. They saw two children who'd been essentially dead inside for 7 years suddenly showing signs of life. Whatever this human was doing, it was the first thing that had gotten any response from the heirs. Killing him now would be insane. The arguments raged for 3 days. Council meetings devolved into shouting matches. Ancient political alliances fractured over the question of what to do about the human janitor. Finally, Empress Vera made her decision. The human could continue his work. He would be under constant surveillance, with guards monitoring his every interaction with the children. And if he did anything that even looked like a threat, anything at all, the consequences would be severe. Not just for him. For his entire species. Every human in Dravaxi space would be expelled, their contracts voided, their people banned from ever returning. Jake learned about all this from his supervisor, a nervous Dravaxi named Kellen who could barely look him in the eye while delivering the news. The weight of it hit Jake like a physical blow. He wasn't just responsible for himself anymore. One wrong move and he'd destroy the futures of thousands of human workers who were counting on these contracts. People like him who'd signed up to give their families better lives. That night, Jake seriously considered requesting a transfer to a different section of the palace. But when he arrived for his shift, Talon and Lyria were already waiting in the hallway. They didn't smile or wave or show any obvious emotion. But there was something in the way they stood there, something almost hopeful, that made Jake's decision for him. These were just kids who were hurting. He couldn't abandon them because the stakes had gotten higher. So he kept coming back. He greeted the twins politely each night, went about his maintenance work, and pretended the dozen hidden cameras and 3 armed guards weren't tracking his every movement. But he also started bringing small things from his quarters. Nothing expensive or inappropriate. Just simple items that might interest them. A worn deck of playing cards he'd brought from Earth. The twins watched with fascination as he showed them how to play Go Fish, a game simple enough that they could play it without speaking. A harmonica he'd picked up at a market on the station where the transport had stopped. He couldn't play it well, but he showed them how to make sounds with it, and Lyria actually smiled a little when she managed to produce a clear note. He brought sketches he'd made of Earth. Mountains and oceans and cities that looked nothing like Dravaxi architecture. The twins would stare at these drawings for long minutes, tracing the unfamiliar shapes with their fingers. Jake wondered what they thought about, looking at a world so different from their own. 3 weeks into this strange routine, something shifted. Jake was teaching the twins a simple game of checkers, trying to explain the rules through gestures since his Dravaxi was still terrible. His communicator chimed with an incoming message, and he glanced at it reflexively. It was his daughter. Well, not a live message. The time lag between Earth and the Dravaxi homeworld made real-time communication impossible. But she'd sent him a video. Jake smiled and hit play without thinking. His daughter's face filled the small screen, and she started talking about her week at school. She'd aced a chemistry test. Her basketball team had won their game. She missed him terribly but was so proud of what he was doing for their family. Jake felt the familiar ache in his chest. 4 years. He hadn't seen her in person for 4 years. When the message ended, Jake looked up to find both twins staring at him intensely. Not at the communicator, but at his face. At the expression he was wearing. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jake realized he should probably explain. He pulled up a photo of his daughter and showed it to them. In his broken Dravaxi, supplemented with gestures, he tried to explain. This was his child. He loved her very much. He was here, far from home, working so she could have a better future. He sent her messages every week telling her he thought about her every single day. That even though they were apart, she was always in his heart. The twins watched him record his response message. They heard him tell his daughter that he loved her, that he was proud of her, that he couldn't wait to see her again. They saw the way his whole face softened when he talked about her. The warmth in his voice. The unguarded affection. It was something they'd never experienced with their own mother. Empress Vera loved them, Jake was sure of that. But Dravaxi royalty didn't show emotion the way humans did. Love was expressed through duty, through protection, through providing the best education and opportunities. Not through warm words and soft smiles and casual physical affection. The Empress was always the Empress, even with her own children. There was always distance, always formality. Jake was just himself. A tired middle-aged man who missed his kid and wasn't afraid to show it. That night, after Jake had finished his shift and was packing up his cart, he heard it. So quiet he almost missed it. Princess Lyria was humming. Not perfectly, the melody was a bit off. But she was trying to copy the lullaby Jake had been singing for weeks. Trying to make the same sounds, match the same rhythm. Prince Talon's hand shot out so fast it made Jake jump. He grabbed his sister's wrist, not roughly but urgently. And for the first time in 7 years, the twins really looked at each other. Not just the blank stares they'd shared in their silent world. This was different. Talon's eyes were wide, almost scared. Lyria's were filling with tears. Jake stood very still, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might break whatever was happening. The twins stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, Talon released his sister's wrist. Lyria kept humming, a bit stronger now. And Talon, after a moment's hesitation, joined her. The sound was fragile and imperfect. But it was the first sound either twin had voluntarily made in 7 years. And it was the sound of healing beginning. The guards who'd been watching from their discreet positions immediately called for supervisors. Within minutes, the recordings were being rushed to the Empress. And Jake, still standing there with his cleaning cart, realized he might have just changed the fate of an empire with nothing more than some card games and a lullaby his mother taught him 50 years ago. Retry SF. The arrival of Empress Vera was an event that sent shockwaves through the entire East Wing. She didn't send messengers or subordinates. She came herself, striding through the corridors with a presence that made the air itself seem heavier. Guards snapped to attention. Palace staff practically melted into the walls trying to stay out of her way. And Jake, who'd been summoned from his small quarters in the workers' section, felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he walked toward the royal audience chamber. He'd never seen the Empress up close before. She was massive by human standards, easily 3 meters tall, with skin that seemed to shimmer like polished stone. A crown of living crystal grew from her head, pulsing with soft blue light. Everything about her radiated power and authority. This was someone who commanded fleets, who made decisions that affected trillions of lives, who'd held an empire together through assassination attempts and political upheaval and the pressure of raising broken children alone. Jake was a janitor from Cleveland who'd spent most of his adult life fixing leaky pipes and arguing with school administrators about maintenance budgets. The audience chamber was smaller than he'd expected, more intimate. Just the Empress, a handful of senior advisors, the twins sitting quietly in chairs along the wall, and Jake standing in the center of the room feeling completely out of his depth. Vera studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and precise. "Explain to me what you have done to my children." Jake swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to be diplomatic, to carefully measure his words, to remember he was talking to someone who could have him executed with a gesture. But he'd never been good at talking like a politician. So he just told her the truth. "Nothing special, Your Majesty. I just treat them like kids who've been through something terrible, not like problems that need fixing." The silence that followed was deafening. Several advisors looked horrified. One actually gasped. Nobody spoke to the Empress that bluntly. But Vera's expression didn't change. She gestured for him to continue. Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't a psychologist or a therapist. Everything he knew about trauma he'd learned from raising his daughter through some rough patches after her mother left. But he tried to explain it the best he could. Back on Earth, he said, there was a lot of research about how trauma affected people, especially children. When something really bad happened, sometimes the mind just shut down as a protection mechanism. It was like a circuit breaker flipping to prevent the whole system from burning out. The problem was getting that circuit breaker to flip back on. You couldn't force it. Pushing too hard just made things worse. The Dravaxi approach had been all about intervention. Neural stimulation, memory therapy, constant medical monitoring. To them, the twins were a problem to be solved through logic and science. But trauma didn't work that way. The twins didn't need another doctor poking around in their heads. They didn't need another specialist analyzing their every move. They needed to feel safe. They needed permission to be vulnerable again without judgment or expectation. They need someone who doesn't want anything from them, Jake said quietly. "I'm just a janitor. I don't care if they talk or don't talk. I don't need them to perform or prove anything. I'm just there, doing my job, and they can be around me without pressure. No expectations. No agenda. Just presence." One of the advisors, an elderly Dravaxi with scars across his face, spoke up. This is absurd. The human suggests we've been treating the heirs incorrectly for 7 years? Our finest physicians, our most advanced treatments, all wrong. Jake wanted to shrink back but forced himself to stand firm. Not wrong, sir. Just incomplete. You were treating their brains, but nobody was treating their hearts. Empress Vera held up a hand, silencing the advisor before he could respond. She studied Jake for a long moment, then looked at her children. Talon and Lyria sat motionless, watching the exchange with those two old eyes. But there was something different about them now. A spark that hadn't been there before. What do you suggest? The Empress asked. Jake hadn't expected that question. He fumbled for an answer. Just, let me keep doing what I'm doing? I bring simple things. Music, games, art supplies. Stuff that lets them express feelings without words. And I talk to them like they're people, not patients. I tell them about Earth, about my daughter, about normal boring stuff. I give them examples of what healthy emotions look like. He paused, then added something that had been bothering him. And maybe, Your Majesty, they need to see you being vulnerable too. Not just as the Empress. As their mother. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every advisor looked like they wanted to tackle Jake and drag him out before he got himself killed. But Vera just continued staring at him with that unreadable expression. Finally, she nodded once. Continue your work. You will have full access to the children, within reason. But understand this, human. If you fail, if they regress, if any harm comes to them because of your methods, the consequences will be severe. Jake nodded. He understood. He was being given a chance, but it came with a weight that made his knees weak. Over the following weeks, Jake continued his nightly routine with the twins, but now with official Imperial approval. The difference was remarkable. Without the threat of immediate execution hanging over his head, he could relax and be more creative. He introduced them to music therapy, showing them how rhythm and melody could express things words couldn't. He brought modeling clay and let them sculpt whatever came to mind. He taught them to play simple instruments badly and laugh at the awful sounds they made together. Slowly, incrementally, the twins began to engage. They started humming more often. Then making other sounds, little exclamations of surprise or frustration or amusement. They began to mimic the sounds Jake made when demonstrating the harmonica or teaching them new songs. They even laughed, quietly at first, when Jake deliberately butchered the pronunciation of Dravaxi words while trying to teach himself their language. It was during one of these sessions, about 6 weeks into the new arrangement, that Prince Talon did something unexpected. Jake was sitting on the floor, sketching a picture of his daughter's school, when Talon approached him with a data tablet. The boy's hands were shaking slightly as he held it out. Jake took it carefully. On the screen was video footage, old and grainy. It took him a moment to realize what he was watching. The royal family at dinner. The Emperor, alive and smiling. And then chaos. People screaming. The Emperor moving fast, shoving 2 small children behind a pillar. The awful sound of weapons fire. The way the Emperor fell. Jake's hands tightened on the tablet. He looked up at Talon, and the boy was crying. Silent tears streaming down his face, but crying nonetheless. Jake set the tablet aside and did the only thing he could think of. He opened his arms in invitation. Talon collapsed into the hug like a puppet with cut strings. He buried his face in Jake's shoulder and shook with silent sobs. Lyria rushed over and pressed against her brother's back, and Jake wrapped his other arm around her. He didn't say anything. Didn't try to make it better with words. He just held them while they cried for the first time in 7 years. And when Talon finally pulled back, his face red and wet, he looked Jake directly in the eyes and spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but the words were clear. He said, "Protect each other. Always. That was the last thing Father told us. But we couldn't even talk to each other. How could we protect each other if we couldn't even do that?" Jake felt tears in his own eyes. "You protected each other by staying together. By surviving. That's what your father wanted. And now you're starting to heal. That's protecting each other too." Talon nodded slowly, then buried his face in Jake's shoulder again. And Jake held him, this alien prince who'd been carrying impossible weight for 7 years, and let him finally be a scared kid who missed his dad. The news of Prince Talon's first words spread through the imperial palace like wildfire, then beyond to the planetary capital, and within days across the entire Dravaxi Empire. After 7 years of silence, one of the heirs to the throne had spoken. The political implications were staggering. Suddenly, rivals who'd been positioning themselves as potential successors found their careful plans crumbling. The twins weren't broken after all. They could be healed. They could rule. But what really shocked the Empire, what caused heated debates in council chambers across 100 worlds, was who the prince had spoken to. Not to the Empress. Not to the finest physicians or the most revered spiritual advisors. To a human janitor. A maintenance worker from a species the Dravaxi had considered barely civilized just a few years ago. The traditionalists were furious. They demanded explanations, investigations, anything to make sense of how their carefully ordered universe had been turned upside down. How could a primitive human succeed where the Empire's best had failed? It was embarrassing. It was humiliating. It challenged every assumption they held about Dravaxi superiority. But the results were undeniable. Talon had spoken. And 3 days later, Princess Lyria followed her brother's lead. It happened during one of Jake's evening sessions with the twins. They developed a comfortable routine by now. Jake would arrive around sunset, greet them warmly, and they'd spend a few hours together doing simple activities. That particular evening, Jake was teaching them a card game called Crazy Eights. Nothing complicated, just something to occupy their hands while they relaxed together. Lyria kept making mistakes with the rules, getting frustrated when she'd lay down the wrong card. But instead of shutting down like she might have weeks ago, she was trying. Really trying. Jake could see the concentration on her face, the way she studied the cards in her hand, the little furrow between her eyebrows when she was thinking hard. After one particularly confusing round, Lyria set down her cards and looked directly at Jake. Her mouth opened, then closed. She seemed to be wrestling with something internal, some enormous decision. Jake stayed quiet, not wanting to pressure her, but his heart was pounding. He could feel it coming. Finally, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, Lyria spoke. "Will you teach us your song? The one you always hum when you work." 3 simple sentences. 15 words. But they might as well have been an earthquake for the impact they had. Jake felt tears welling up immediately. He'd been working with these kids for months now, watching them slowly come back to life, but hearing Lyria's actual voice was something else entirely. It was delicate and uncertain, like she was testing whether the world would punish her for breaking her silence. "Of course I will," Jake said, keeping his own voice gentle. "It's just an old lullaby my mom used to sing to me. I'd be honored to teach you both." Over the next hour, Jake taught them the words. It was a simple melody, nothing fancy. The lyrics were about moonlight and stars and being safe at home. The twins stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds of English, their alien vocal cords not quite designed for human languages. But they tried. They really tried. And when they finally got through the whole song together, all 3 of them were smiling. Word reached Empress Vera within minutes. The security feeds were still monitored constantly, and the moment Lyria spoke, alerts went out to every relevant official. The Empress arrived personally an hour later, though she stayed back and watched from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. She saw her children singing with the human. Saw them laughing when they messed up the words. Saw them relaxed and happy in a way she couldn't remember seeing since before their father died. And she saw the human treating them not like precious royal heirs who needed to be handled with extreme care, but like regular kids learning something new. When the session ended and Jake was packing up to leave, Vera stepped into the room. The twins immediately stiffened, old habits kicking in. Around their mother, they were always expected to maintain certain standards of behavior. But Vera surprised everyone. She knelt down, bringing herself to their eye level, and simply opened her arms. Talon and Lyria hesitated for just a moment, then rushed forward into their mother's embrace. And for the first time in longer than Jake had been alive, the Empress of the Dravaxi Empire held her children and let herself cry in front of someone outside the immediate family. Jake quietly slipped out to give them privacy, but not before he saw Vera mouth 2 words to him, "Thank you." The following days were chaos of a different sort. The political landscape of the Empire shifted dramatically. With the heirs clearly on a path to recovery, succession plans changed overnight. Rivals backed down. Old alliances reformed. The future of the Empire, which had seemed so uncertain, suddenly had direction again. But amid all the political maneuvering, Empress Vera did something unprecedented. She summoned Jake to a private audience, without advisors or guards or witnesses. Just the 2 of them in a small sitting room that felt oddly intimate for someone of her stature. She offered him everything. A permanent position as royal tutor with a title and estate. Wealth beyond anything Jake had imagined. Citizenship in the Empire with all the privileges that entailed. The opportunity to bring his daughter to the Dravaxi homeworld and give her an education at the finest institutions in 3 galaxies. Jake sat there, overwhelmed, as the Empress laid out a future that would solve every financial worry he'd ever had. His daughter could have anything she wanted. He'd never have to work another day of manual labor in his life. He'd be part of history, the human who saved the Imperial heirs. And he turned it all down. Vera actually looked shocked for the first time since Jake had met her. You refuse? Why? Jake struggled to find the right words. Your Majesty, I'm not a teacher or a therapist. I'm just a guy who was in the right place at the right time. What your kids needed was someone who had no agenda, no expectations, nothing to gain from them. If I stay here with titles and wealth, I become something different. I become someone who wants something from them. He took a breath and continued. Besides, I have a daughter back home who's been waiting for me for 4 years. I promised her 5 years and then I'd come home. She's been so patient, so strong. I can't break that promise. She needs her dad. The Empress studied him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, she smiled. It was a small smile, tired and sad, but genuine. You are a remarkable human, Jake Miller. My children are fortunate to have known you. She granted him one thing he didn't refuse, full completion of his contract with double the agreed payment. Enough to secure his daughter's future and then some. And she promised that the twins could maintain communication with him after he left, if he was willing. Always, Jake said. They can message me anytime they want. I'll always answer. Before he left the Dravaxi homeworld, there was one more thing that needed to happen. One final public moment that would become legend across the Empire. The twins were scheduled to make their first official public appearance since before their father's death. It would be at a formal imperial court gathering, with dignitaries from across the Empire in attendance. Everyone expected a brief appearance, perhaps a few formal words carefully prepared and rehearsed. What they got was something nobody anticipated. The Grand Imperial Court was a sight that took Jake's breath away even though he'd been on the Dravaxi homeworld for months now. The chamber was enormous, with vaulted ceilings that seemed to stretch into infinity. Crystalline pillars caught the light and scattered it into 1,000 colors. Hundreds of dignitaries filled the space, representatives from every corner of the Empire. Planetary governors, military commanders, trade ministers, religious leaders, all dressed in their finest ceremonial attire. Jake stood in the servants' section, far to the side and elevated enough to see but clearly separated from the important guests. He wore his cleanest work uniform, the only formal clothing he owned. Several other human workers stood near him, all of them nervous and excited to witness this historic moment. The return of the Imperial heirs to public life after 7 years of silence. The atmosphere in the chamber was electric with anticipation and unspoken tension. Everyone knew this appearance would set the tone for the twins' future. Would they seem weak and damaged? Would they be able to command respect? The entire political future of the Empire hung on how these 2 traumatized children performed in front of an audience of the most powerful beings in 3 galaxies. Empress Vera entered first, and the entire assembly rose as one. She took her place on the throne, regal and composed as always. Then the announcement everyone had been waiting for. The Lord Chancellor, his voice amplified throughout the chamber, declared the arrival of Prince Talon and Princess Lyria. The twins entered through the main doors, walking side by side. They looked so small in that massive space, despite being tall by human standards. They wore formal royal attire, elegant but not overly ornate. Their faces were calm, but Jake could see the tension in their shoulders, the slight tremor in Lyria's hands. They were terrified. They walked the long path to stand before their mother's throne. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Hundreds of beings holding their breath, waiting to see if the heirs would speak, and if so, what they would say. Talon stepped forward first. His voice was quiet but steady as he addressed the court in formal Dravaxi, thanking them for their patience and support during the difficult years. The words were clearly prepared, probably written by advisors and rehearsed carefully. But he delivered them well, with dignity. Then Lyria spoke, echoing similar sentiments. Her voice was stronger than her brother's, and Jake felt proud watching her stand there with her head high. These were the same kids who'd been locked in silence, unable to face the world. And now they were addressing the most powerful court in known space. But then something unexpected happened. Something that wasn't in any prepared script. Talon and Lyria looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. They nodded slightly, then turned to face the court again. Talon's voice rang out clearer this time. There is someone here today who saved our lives, though he used no weapons and wore no armor. He is not Dravaxi. He is human. And he taught us something that all your physicians and therapists could not. A ripple of shock went through the assembly. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how imperial addresses were supposed to go. Several advisors near the throne looked panicked, but Empress Vera raised a hand, signaling them to let her children continue. Lyria spoke next. He taught us that it's okay to feel pain. That healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending. He taught us that we could be vulnerable without being weak. And he did this through the simplest of things. Through kindness. Through presence. Through song. Jake felt his face burning as hundreds of alien eyes turned to find him in the servants section. He wanted to disappear into the floor, but he forced himself to stand straight. Whatever the twins were doing, they deserved his support. We would like to honor him now, Talon continued. Not with titles or wealth, which he has already refused. But with something more precious. We would like to share with you all the first song we learned to sing after 7 years of silence. The court erupted in whispers. This was unprecedented. Royal heirs didn't perform like entertainers at formal functions. This was beneath their dignity. Several of the more traditional dignitaries looked scandalized. But Empress Vera stood from her throne and descended the steps to stand beside her children. She looked at them with an expression Jake had never seen on her face before. Pride, yes, but also something softer. She placed a hand on each of their shoulders and nodded. The twins began to sing. It was Jake's lullaby, the simple melody he'd hummed while cleaning floors and fixing air conditioning units. The song his mother had taught him decades ago in a small house in Ohio. The words were in English, a language most of the court didn't understand. The twins' pronunciation was imperfect, their alien vocal cords giving the familiar words a strange and haunting quality. But the emotion was unmistakable. They sang about moonlight and safety in home. About peace and comfort and being loved. Their voices were thin and uncertain at first, but grew stronger with each verse. And then, incredibly, Empress Vera joined them. She didn't know all the words, but she hummed the melody, supporting her children with her presence. The effect on the court was profound. These rigid, formal beings who measured worth in power and status were watching their rulers be completely, vulnerably human. Well, not human exactly, but real in a way that protocol and ceremony usually hid. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed confused. But many, especially the older ones who remembered the twins' father, had tears in their eyes. Jake was crying openly now, not caring who saw. His simple lullaby, sung imperfectly by 3 aliens in front of the most powerful court in the galaxy. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was everything he'd never imagined when he signed up to mop floors on an alien world. When the song ended, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, starting from somewhere in the back and spreading forward, the entire court began the traditional Dravaxi gesture of respect, a slow, rhythmic tapping of right hands against left shoulders. The sound built and built until it filled the massive chamber like thunder. Empress Vera turned toward Jake and did something that would be recorded in every history book written about this era. She bowed. A full, deep bow. The Empress of the Dravaxi Empire bowing to a human janitor. And the entire court, following her lead, bowed as well. Jake stood there, overwhelmed and tearful, and managed to bow back. It was all he could think to do. The ceremony concluded shortly after, but Jake barely remembered the rest of it. He was in a daze, processing what had just happened. When the court finally dispersed and Jake was preparing to return to his quarters, 2 familiar figures appeared beside him. Talon and Lyria, escorted by guards but moving with purpose. They threw their arms around Jake in a fierce hug, not caring about protocol or who was watching. "Thank you," Talon whispered. "For everything. Don't forget us," Lyria added. "When you go home to your daughter. Don't forget us." Jake hugged them back tightly. "Never. I promise. You can message me anytime, and I'll answer. Always." 2 weeks later, Jake boarded a transport bound for Earth. His contract was complete. His pockets held enough credits to secure his daughter's future twice over. And his personal communicator held dozens of messages from 2 young aliens promising to write regularly. As the ship lifted off and the Dravaxi homeworld grew smaller below, Jake thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd come to an alien world to mop floors and fix machinery. He'd expected to be invisible, just another worker doing a job. Instead, he'd somehow ended up saving 2 traumatized children simply by treating them with basic human kindness. The galaxy would remember this story, he knew. The human janitor who sang lullabies to alien royalty would become legend. Scholars would study what happened, trying to extract lessons and methodologies. Politicians would debate the implications for interspecies relations. Therapists would write papers about his techniques. But Jake knew the truth was much simpler than any of that. He hadn't done anything special or heroic. He just recognized pain when he saw it and responded with compassion. He treated two alien children like they were his own daughter, with patience, with kindness, with the understanding that healing takes time and can't be rushed. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone isn't advanced technology or sophisticated strategy. Sometimes it's just sitting with them in their pain, showing them they're not alone, and humming a simple song about moonlight and home. The transport jumped to faster than light speed, and Jake closed his eyes, already composing the message he'd send to his daughter. He had so much to tell her. And somewhere behind him, on a world he'd never see again, two young aliens were learning to be whole again, one small step at a time. The Dravaxi Empire would endure. The twins would eventually rule with wisdom earned through suffering and healing. And they would always remember the human who taught them that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be vulnerable enough to sing.